The champagne flute felt like a shard of ice in her hand, a stark contrast to the burning humiliation creeping up her neck. At the center of the grand ballroom, under the weight of 1,000 glittering crystals, her ex-husband Gregory Shaw laughed. It was a sound she knew well, a sharp, cruel bark that he reserved for things he found pathetic. And tonight that thing was her. Dressed in her simple black catering uniform, she was a ghost at the feast of her former life. He pointed his new diamond cuff-linked hand, gesturing dismissively. "That," he sneered to his crowd of admirers. "Oh, that's just Dina. She used to be my wife. Now, she's a nobody." The words echoed in the sudden silence, each one a stone thrown at her fragile composure. But what Gregory, his vapid fiancé, and this entire glittering world didn't know was that a nobody was about to become somebody they would never forget, the annual saint. Jude's Foundation Gala was the undisputed pinnacle of the city's social calendar. It was a night where old money and new ambition collided in a symphony of rustling silk, discreetly flashed jewelry, and the clinking of glasses filled with vintage Dom Perignon. For most attendees it was a stage. For Dina Faria, it was just a job. As a junior event coordinator for Elegance Delivered, her role was to be invisible. She checked floral arrangements, ensured the string quartet began on time, and made sure that the catering staff moved like silent phantoms through the throngs of the city's elite. It was honest work, a crucial stepping stone in rebuilding a life that had been shattered 2 years ago. Her life with Gregory Shaw now felt like a film she had watched about someone else. He was a supernova in the world of mergers and acquisitions, a man whose ambition was as sharp and tailored as his custom-made suits. Dina had been his college sweetheart, the quiet, artistic girl who had grounded him. She'd put her own dreams of being a painter on hold to create a perfect home for him, to host the perfect dinners for his clients, to be the perfect, smiling, supportive wife. She was the foundation upon which he built his empire. And then once the empire was secure, he'd decided the foundation was outdated. He'd called it decoupling, a sterile corporate term for ripping her heart out. He said he needed a partner who was on his level, not someone holding him back. His new partner, Bianca Vanderbilt, a woman whose family name was etched onto half the buildings in the financial district, was a merger of a different kind. Dina tried to avoid looking at them, but it was impossible. Gregory stood near the marble fountain, one arm draped possessively around Bianca's impossibly small waist. Bianca was a vision in blood-red couture, her laughter high and brittle. They were the reigning king and queen of this gilded cage, and Dina was just a servant ensuring the cage remained polished. "Excuse me, you?" The voice was sharp, dripping with condescension. Dina turned from adjusting a centerpiece of white orchids. A woman she vaguely recognized from Gregory's circle, a socialite named Penelope Finch, was snapping her fingers at her. "The canapes are cold, and my husband needs another scotch. See to it." She didn't wait for a response, simply turning her back. Dina's jaw tightened. She took a deep breath, radioed the bar for the drink, and went to find a server with a fresh tray. As she was directing the server toward Penelope's group, she saw Gregory's eyes land on her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the same smile he'd given her the day he told her to pack her things. He nudged Bianca and murmured something in her ear. They both looked over their expressions, a mixture of amusement and disdain. He then deliberately steered his group of friends, powerful men, and their impeccably maintained wives, in her direction. Dina's heart hammered against her ribs. Her training screamed at her to fade into the wallpaper, to become part of the scenery. But there was no escape. They formed a semicircle around her, their glittering gowns and dark tuxedos creating an impenetrable wall. "Well, well, look what we have here." Gregory began, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The ambient chatter began to die down as people sensed the unfolding drama. "I was just telling my friends about the importance of reinvention." He looked directly at Dina, his eyes cold and mocking. "Take my ex-wife, for example. A real testament to downward mobility." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group. Bianca let out a delicate, practiced laugh. "Oh, Gregory, don't be cruel," she said, though her eyes were anything but kind. "I think it's quaint that she's found a little hobby to keep herself busy." Dina stood frozen, the tray of mini quiches in her hand, suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, dissecting her simple uniform, her plain hairstyle, her face devoid of the expensive cosmetic enhancements that were standard issue in this room. One of Gregory's friends, a hedge fund manager named Robert Conway, leaned in. "Is that really her, Greg? I almost didn't recognize her without the country club membership." The dam of Dina's composure began to crack. She wanted the marble floor to swallow her whole. "That!" Gregory's voice boomed with theatrical finality. He pointed his chin at her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "Oh, that's just Dina. She used to be my wife. Now—" He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air before delivering the killing blow. "Now she's a nobody." The words struck her with physical force. A nobody. The woman who had edited his legal briefs at 3 a.m., who had nursed him through the flu when a $1 million deal was on the line, who had chosen his tie for every crucial meeting because he was colorblind. The woman who had given up her own identity to bolster his. A nobody. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and shameful. She refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking with his. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silent defiance, the flicker of unbroken spirit in her eyes, seemed to infuriate him more than any outburst would have. He scoffed and turned away, leading his coterie of hyenas to the bar. "Let's get a real drink." The crowd's attention shifted away the moment over. The string quartet began a new piece by Vivaldi. For everyone else, the night went on. But for Dina, the world had ground to a halt. She stood there, a ghost in a black uniform, the brand of his words seared into her soul. A nobody. In that moment of profound public humiliation, a tiny cold spark of anger ignited within her. It was a small flame, but it was enough. It was the beginning of a fire they would all come to feel. The drive back to her small one-bedroom apartment in a less fashionable part of the city was a blur of streetlights and unshed tears. The grand ballroom of the hotel, with its soaring ceilings and judgmental eyes, felt 1,000,000 miles away, yet Gregory's voice echoed in her ears. Nobody. 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 She unlocked her door and stepped into the quiet embrace of her sanctuary. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The air smelled of turpentine and brewing chamomile tea. In the corner of the living room stood an easel holding a large, half-finished canvas. It depicted a stormy seascape, the waves churning with a violent, chaotic energy that mirrored the turmoil in her chest. She had started painting again 6 months after the divorce. At first her hands had felt clumsy, her muse long gone. But slowly, with each brushstroke, she had begun to reclaim a piece of the girl she'd been before she became Mrs. Gregory Shaw. Tonight, however, the painting offered no solace. She sank onto her worn velvet armchair, pulling an old quilt around her shoulders. The humiliation was a physical ache. It wasn't just that Gregory had insulted her. He had done it on purpose, using her as a prop to elevate himself and his new shiny fiancée. He had erased their history, their shared life, and cast her as a footnote in his grand narrative. As the self-pity threatened to drown her, her mind drifted seeking refuge. It settled on a memory from a few months back, a memory that felt like a lifetime ago. It was during her brief stint working part-time at the Daily Grind, a cozy independent coffee shop with mismatched furniture and the best espresso in the neighborhood. She'd taken the job for extra money but had stayed for the quiet, anonymous rhythm of it all. He had been a regular. A man who called himself Leo. He never seemed in a hurry, unlike the other customers who barked their orders while typing on their phones. He would sit at the small table in the back corner, a worn paperback in hand, a simple black coffee before him. He was tall, with kind, observant eyes and a quiet intensity that drew her in. He dressed simply, jeans, a plain t-shirt, a faded leather jacket. There was nothing about him that screamed wealth or power. He was just Leo. One afternoon, he'd noticed her sketching on a napkin during a lull. "Is that the pier down by the old wharf?" he'd asked, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. Dina had jumped startled. "Oh, yes, I used to go there all the time." "You have a good eye for light," he'd said, gesturing to the way she'd captured the afternoon sun hitting the water. "The reflection, it's not just a mirror. You've captured the depth." No one had talked about her art with such insight in over a decade. Gregory had always called it her little hobby. For Leo to see something more in a 5-minute napkin sketch felt like a balm to a wound she didn't even know was still open. Their conversations became a regular occurrence. They talked about art books, music, the quiet melancholy of a rainy Sunday. He never asked about her past, and she never offered it. To him, she wasn't a failed socialite or a bitter ex-wife. She was Dina the barista who could draw and had a thoughtful opinion on Russian literature. He told her he was in tech, a vague description that she accepted without question. He was taking a sabbatical, he'd explained, trying to reconnect with the world outside of code and boardrooms. He had a way of listening that made her feel seen, truly seen. He didn't fill the silences with his own achievements. He asked questions and genuinely waited for the answers. Then about 2 months ago, he had simply stopped coming in. There was no goodbye, no explanation, just an empty table in the corner. Dina had been disappointed more than she cared to admit. She told herself he was a transient figure, a pleasant interlude, but she missed their conversations. She missed the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when she said something that amused him. Sitting in her dark apartment, the memory of Leo's kindness was a stark contrast to Gregory's cruelty. Leo had seen worth in her when she was just a barista sketching on a napkin. Gregory, who had known her intimately for 10 years, saw her as a nobody because she was no longer wearing designer clothes and a diamond ring he had paid for. The thought solidified something within her. Gregory's opinion was a reflection of his own shallow values, not her inherent worth. His power came from his money, his status, his ability to make others feel small. Leo's quiet strength came from somewhere else entirely, from a place of substance and character. She stood up and walked over to the canvas. The stormy sea looked different now. It was no longer just a reflection of her pain. She saw power in the crashing waves, a relentless, cleansing force. She picked up a brush, her fingers no longer trembling. She dipped it in a deep, cerulean blue. Gregory had tried to define her tonight. He had presented his version of her story to the world. But he didn't get to write her ending. She would paint her own. The first stroke on the canvas was firm, decisive, a single defiant line of color against the raging storm. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Weeks turned into a month. The sting of the gala incident faded into a dull ache, a scar she now carried with a strange sense of pride. It had been a baptism by fire, and she had not been consumed. She threw herself into her work with a new, quiet determination. She took on more responsibility at Elegance Delivered, earning the respect of her boss, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia. Dina's eye for detail and her calm demeanor under pressure made her invaluable. She also dedicated every spare moment to her art, finishing the stormy seascape and starting a new, more hopeful series inspired by the city's hidden gardens. The next major event on her calendar was the launch of the Davenport Corporation's new Green Energy Initiative. It was being held at the Museum of Modern Art, a venue that made Dina's artistic heart sing. This was a different crowd from the St. Jude's Gala. It was less about old money and more about new-age tech billionaires, innovative thinkers, and venture capitalists. The atmosphere was electric with possibility, not just stale with entitlement. Dina was in her element, clipboard in hand, ensuring the avant-garde catering was presented perfectly against the backdrop of Warhols and Pollocks. She felt a sense of professional pride, a feeling that was entirely her own. Gregory and Bianca were, of course, in attendance. Gregory's firm was a key investor in one of Davenport's subsidiary companies. Seeing them no longer sent a jolt of panic through her. Instead, she felt a cool wave of indifference. She watched them work the room, their smiles dazzlingly fake, and felt a profound sense of pity for them. Their world was so small, so dependent on the validation of others. Her focus was on her job. The keynote speaker was running late, and she was coordinating with the museum staff to keep the guests engaged. As she spoke into her headset, her eyes scanned the main hall, and she froze. There, standing by a towering sculpture of twisted steel, was him. It was Leo. But it wasn't. This man wore a bespoke charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin. His hair was perfectly styled, not casually tousled. He wasn't holding a worn paperback. He was surrounded by a deferential circle of some of the most powerful people in the country. He commanded the space with the same quiet intensity she remembered, but now it was magnified 100-fold. He wasn't a man on sabbatical. He was a man in charge. Her mind struggled to reconcile the two images, the gentle, unassuming book lover from the coffee shop and this titan of industry. Could it be a coincidence? A doppelganger? As if sensing her stare, he turned his head, his eyes sweeping across the room. For a split second his gaze met hers. A flicker of something recognition. Surprise, something else she couldn't name crossed his features, before it was gone, replaced by a polite, neutral mask, as a senator clapped him on the shoulder. Dina's heart was pounding. It was him. But who was he? She fumbled for the event program on her clipboard. Her eyes scanned the list of speakers and honored guests. And then she saw it under the title of CEO and founder of the Davenport Corporation. The name was Liam Davenport. Not Leo. Liam. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Liam Davenport was a near-mythical figure in the business world. A self-made billionaire who had started his company in a garage and turned it into a global leader in sustainable technology. He was notoriously private, rarely photographed, and known for his brilliant, almost reclusive nature. He was the man who had hosted this entire lavish event. Her Leo, the quiet man who discussed art with her over a $2 coffee, was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the world. 1,000 questions flooded her mind. Why had he used a fake name? Why had he spent his afternoons in a humble coffee shop? Was it all some kind of game? A social experiment for a bored billionaire? The thought soured the sweet memory of their conversations. Had he been laughing at her internally, the simple little barista with her napkin sketches? The warmth she'd felt for Leo was instantly replaced by a cold defensive wall. She was an expert in being played for a fool. She had a decade of experience. Throughout the rest of the evening, she felt his eyes on her. She would be checking on the lighting rig, and she'd feel a prickle on the back of her neck, turning to see him looking her way before his attention was pulled back to a conversation. He didn't approach her. He kept his distance, always surrounded, always engaged. This silent, long-distance observation was almost worse than another public confrontation with Gregory. It was unnerving, confusing. It made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. As the event wound down, Dina was supervising the breakdown crew near the service exit. It was late, and the last of the guests were departing from the main entrance. She was exhausted, her mind a tangled mess of Liam, Leo, and Gregory. "Dina!" The voice was quiet right behind her. It was his voice, Leo's voice. She turned slowly. Liam Davenport stood there away from the lingering guests and his security detail. In the dim light of the service corridor, without the crowd and the adulation, he looked more like the man she remembered. His suit jacket was off, his tie was loosened, and his expression was hesitant. "It's you," she said, her voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "It is," he confirmed. "I owe you an explanation." "No, you don't," she said, her tone clipped. She turned back to her work. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Davenport." The formal address hung in the air between them. She heard him take a step closer. "Please," he said, his voice laced with a sincerity that chipped at her defenses. "Can we talk somewhere else tomorrow?" She thought of Gregory's sneering face. She thought of the label, "Nobody." She thought of this powerful, enigmatic man who had for a few blissful weeks made her feel like somebody. She didn't know what his game was, but she knew one thing for certain. She was done being a pawn in any man's world, whether he was a corporate raider or a tech billionaire. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," she said, not looking at him. "I was just a barista." "I'm sure you were just killing time. The sabbatical's over. Welcome back to your life." She walked away without a backward glance, leaving Liam Davenport standing alone in the shadows of the museum, the silence of the empty hall his only answer. For 2 days, Dina tried to push Liam Davenport out of her mind. She told herself it didn't matter. He was from a different universe, a celestial body whose orbit had only briefly, inexplicably intersected with her own. To dwell on it was to invite heartbreak. But the questions lingered, chipping away at her resolve. Why had he sought her out? Why did he look so regretful? Her answer came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was at her old haunt, the Daily Grind. Not as a worker, but as a customer seeking the comfort of a familiar place. She was sketching in a small notepad, a cup of tea steaming beside her, when the bell above the door chimed. Liam Davenport walked in. This time he was dressed as Leo. Faded jeans, a simple gray Henley, and the same worn leather jacket. He looked completely out of place, and yet somehow perfectly at home. He ignored the handful of patrons who did a double-take, their minds trying to place the famous face in such a mundane setting. His eyes found her immediately. He walked to her table holding a small potted orchid. "Is this seat taken?" he asked softly. Dina looked up, her heart doing a complicated flip. "What are you doing here?" "I believe I owe you an explanation," he said, sliding into the opposite chair. He placed the orchid on the table between them. "And I'm not leaving until you hear it." She crossed her arms, her skepticism a shield. "I'm listening." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, vulnerable, a far cry from the untouchable CEO at the museum. "First," he began, "my name is Liam. My friends, the very few I have, call me Leo. It was a nickname from college. It's not fake. It's just private." He leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. "That sabbatical I told you about wasn't entirely a lie. My company was facing a hostile takeover attempt. It was brutal, a complete betrayal by a man I considered a mentor. I was working 20-hour days surrounded by lawyers and bankers, people like your ex-husband." He paused, letting that sink in. "I was losing myself in the fight. I felt disconnected from anything real. My security advisor insisted I vary my routine for safety, so I started coming here instead of the place near my office. And I just kept coming back. This place, these conversations with you, they were the only real things in my life for months." "You weren't a barista, Dina. You were my anchor." Dina's defenses began to soften. She remembered the shadows under his eyes on some days, the palpable tension in his shoulders. It hadn't been a game. He had been in a war of his own. "Why did you disappear?" she asked, her voice softer now. "The takeover fight reached its climax. I had to go dark. For 2 months I barely slept. I was flying between New York, London, and Tokyo. My phone was off limits for non-essential communication. I couldn't risk calling you. By the time it was over and we had won, I felt like too much time had passed. I didn't know how to explain any of this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing his hidden identity, his immense wealth, the chaos of his life. "And the gala," she pressed. "You saw me there. And at the museum. You said nothing." A look of genuine pain crossed his face. "At the first gala, the St. Jude's one, I arrived late. I saw what Shaw did. I saw what he said to you." Dina flinched, the memory still raw. "My first instinct," Liam continued, his voice tight with anger, "was to walk over there and break his jaw. But I saw the look on your face. You were holding yourself together with sheer force of will. I knew if I, a stranger to everyone there, created a scene, it would only make it worse for you. It would turn your private humiliation into a public spectacle, a charity case. You deserved better than that. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I stayed away. At the museum I wanted to talk to you, but I couldn't just shout your name across a crowded room. I was waiting for the right moment. His explanation was so simple, so considerate, it disarmed her completely. He hadn't ignored her out of arrogance. He had stayed away out of respect. He reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers. Dina, our conversations here meant the world to me. You never asked me what I did, what I was worth. You just saw me. After the takeover was done, all I could think about was finding you again. I came back here several times, but you weren't working here anymore. Seeing you at that gala was a shock. It took me a few days to piece together your connection to Gregory Shaw. Finally, she looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the same kindness in his eyes, that she remembered the same sincerity. He wasn't a billionaire playing a part. He was a man who had sought refuge and found it with her. My life is complicated, he said quietly. It's a circus of expectations, pressures, and very few genuine people. I understand if it's too much, but I have to ask, would you be willing to have dinner with me? Not as Liam Davenport, CEO, but as Leo, the guy who loves your drawings and thinks you have a beautiful soul. The question hung in the air, filled with a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. Part of her wanted to run to protect the small, safe world she had so carefully rebuilt. But a larger part of her, the part that had felt truly alive during those coffee shop conversations, knew this was a chance she couldn't refuse. This wasn't about money or status. It was about a connection she had thought was lost forever. She slowly uncrossed her arms and gave him a small, tentative smile. "I'd like that, Leo," she said. Dating a billionaire, Dina quickly learned, was a surreal experience. Their first official date was not at some Michelin star restaurant with a 6-month waiting list. Instead, Liam sent a car to pick her up, a discreet town car, not a flashy limousine, and it took her to a small, unassuming warehouse in the Arts District. Inside was his private world, a massive, light-filled studio. One wall was covered in complex equations and diagrams on whiteboards. Another was a small, state-of-the-art workshop with 3D printers and strange-looking prototypes. And in the center, under a huge skylight, was a simple wooden table set for two, surrounded by a surprising collection of contemporary sculptures. "I tinker here," he explained a little sheepishly. "Helps me think. I thought you might appreciate it more than a stuffy restaurant." He had cooked for her himself a surprisingly delicious pasta dish. They talked for hours, not about his company or her divorce, but about everything else. They discovered a shared love for old black and white films and a mutual dislike for cilantro. He showed her the schematics for a new water purification system he was designing for developing nations, his eyes lighting up with genuine passion. In turn, she showed him photos of her recent paintings on her phone, and he listened with rapt attention as she explained her use of color and texture. With Liam, she never felt like a nobody. He was curious about her thoughts, respectful of her ambitions. When she mentioned wanting to one day open a small gallery to feature local up-and-coming artists, he didn't offer to just buy one for her. Instead, he connected her with a savvy but approachable financial advisor who specialized in small business loans for the arts. "Your dream needs to be yours," he told her. "But I can help you find the right tools." Their relationship blossomed in a carefully guarded bubble. They avoided public places, opting for quiet evenings at his minimalist penthouse overlooking the city, or long drives up the coast in an old restored pickup truck he kept at a country house. He was teaching her how to see the world not as a place of judgment and social hierarchy, but as a place of wonder and possibility. With every passing day, the insecure, humiliated woman from the gala faded, replaced by a confident, radiant Dina who was falling deeply in love. Meanwhile, Gregory and Bianca were escalating their own public romance. Their every move was chronicled in the society pages, a whirlwind trip to Paris to pick out her ring, a lavish charity auction, where they outbid everyone for a yachting trip. Theirs was a relationship performed for an audience. The inevitable announcement came via a glossy feature in Vanity Fair. Gregory Shaw and Bianca Vanderbilt were engaged. The celebration was to be the event of the season, a black tie affair at the legendary Plaza Hotel. Dina felt a pang of nothing. The news was like hearing about a weather report in a distant country. It simply didn't affect her. A few days later, Liam was at her apartment helping her stretch a new canvas. He was surprisingly good at it, his engineer's mind perfectly suited to the precise angles and tension required. "I received an invitation today," he said, casually pulling the canvas taut. "Oh, to an engagement party for a Gregory Shaw and Bianca Vanderbilt." He watched her face carefully for any reaction. Dina just nodded, continuing to prime the canvas. "The whole city got an invitation, I think." "They're a major investor," Liam explained. "It would be a significant business faux pas if I didn't at least make an appearance." He paused, his hand stilling. "I was wondering if you would go with me." Dina's paintbrush stopped mid-air. "Go back there." Into the lion's den. The thought sent a jolt of pure terror through her. The plaza. The same people. The same whispers and stares. "Liam, I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what it's like. They'll eat me alive. They'll look at you and then at me, and they'll say I'm a gold digger, a schemer." He put down his tools and came to stand in front of her, gently taking the paintbrush from her hand. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his steady gaze. "First," he said softly, "I don't give a damn what they say. Their opinions are worthless. Second, you are the most genuine, intelligent, and talented woman I have ever met. You are not a gold digger. You are the gold." His words were a shield against her fear. "And third," he continued, his thumb gently tracing her jawline, "you are not the same woman who was at that gala a few months ago. Look at you, Dina. You're building a new life, you're painting again, you're full of fire. You don't have to hide anymore. I'm not asking you to go for them. I'm asking you to go for us. To walk into that room by my side, and not as a ghost, but as the queen you are." He wasn't pushing her. He was empowering her. This wasn't about revenge on Gregory. It was about declaring her own sovereignty. It was about showing herself that she was no longer afraid. She looked from his earnest face to the bold, bright colors on her new canvas. He was right. She wasn't that person anymore. She had survived the fire. It was time to walk out of the ashes. "Okay," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I'll go, but you should know I have nothing to wear." Liam's smile was dazzling. "Oh, I think we can solve that problem." The night of the engagement party, the air outside the Plaza Hotel crackled with electricity. A fleet of black cars deposited a seemingly endless stream of the city's most powerful and glamorous figures onto a plush red carpet. The flash of paparazzi bulbs was blinding. Inside, the grand ballroom was transformed into an enchanted forest, with towering birch trees, thousands of twinkling fairy lights, and a carpet of white rose petals. At the center of it all, on a raised dais, Gregory and Bianca held court. He was smug and triumphant in a velvet dinner jacket. She was breathtaking in a gown spun from silver thread, a monstrous diamond on her finger catching the light and refracting it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. They had been there for an hour, accepting congratulations, basking in the glow of their combined social and financial power. Gregory felt untouchable. Everything was perfect. And then the massive ballroom doors opened one last time. A hush fell over the room, rippling outwards from the entrance. Liam Davenport had arrived. This in itself was a major event. He rarely attended such functions. But it was the woman on his arm that caused the collective audible gasp. Dina Faria. She was not the mousy, invisible woman in a catering uniform. Tonight she was a vision. She wore a simple, elegant gown of deep sapphire silk that clung to her curves and made her eyes sparkle. Her hair was swept up in a graceful chignon, and around her neck was a single, stunning diamond necklace that was both understated and astronomically expensive. But her most striking accessory was her confidence. She walked with her head held high, her hand resting lightly on Liam's arm, a small, serene smile on her lips. She didn't look defiant or vengeful. She looked happy, at peace. Gregory's face went white, then mottled with a furious, disbelieving red. Bianca's perfectly painted smile froze, cracking at the edges. They looked at Liam, then at Dina, then back again, their brains refusing to process the scene before them. Whispers erupted throughout the ballroom like wildfire. Is that his ex-wife? With Liam Davenport. How is that possible? I thought she was a waitress. That necklace costs more than my car. Liam guided Dina through the crowd, nodding politely to acquaintances, his presence a protective shield around her. He moved with an unhurried grace, completely unfazed by the commotion they were causing. He was leading her toward the dais. Before they could reach it, Gregory intercepted them, his face a thunderous mask. He grabbed Dina's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous, so only she could hear. "What kind of pathetic game are you playing? Did you throw yourself at him? He'll get tired of you in a week, you know. You're a charity case, Dina, a stepping stone." Instead of flinching, Dina slowly and deliberately removed his hand from her arm. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze clear and steady. "Hello, Gregory," she said, her voice calm and even. "You remember Liam, I believe." Liam stepped forward slightly, his height and quiet power a stark contrast to Gregory's sputtering rage. "Shaw," he said, his tone icy. "A word of advice. Never touch her again." Gregory recoiled as if struck. He was no fool. He knew antagonizing Liam Davenport was career suicide. He backed away, his face contorted in a mask of impotent fury, and retreated to Bianca's side. Later the time came for toasts. Gregory took the stage, champagne flute in hand. He gave a smarmy, self-congratulatory speech about his success, his ambition, and finally finding a partner who was his true equal. "To Bianca," he declared, raising his glass and looking at her with performative adoration. "A woman of substance, of pedigree, of class. A woman worthy of the Shaw name. Unlike my past mistakes, which, as we all know, are best left forgotten." He shot a pointed, venomous glare directly at Dina. A few of his sycophants chuckled. Dina felt a familiar sting, but this time Liam's hand found hers under the table, his thumb stroking her knuckles, grounding her. As the polite applause for Gregory's speech died down, Liam stood up. The room fell silent again, all eyes on him. He walked to the stage and took the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and resonant, filling the vast room. "I, too, would like to propose a toast." He turned not to Gregory and Bianca, but to face the crowd, his eyes finding and holding Dina's. "Tonight we've heard a lot about things like pedigree, class, and worth, but I've learned that true worth has very little to do with a family name or the size of a bank account. It has to do with character, with kindness, with the quiet strength it takes to get back up when the world has done its best to knock you down." His gaze never left Dina's. "I met a woman not too long ago. I didn't know her name, I didn't know her past. I just knew she had a brilliant mind and a beautiful soul. I saw her treat every person with a dignity and respect that some people in this very room reserve only for their superiors. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just genuinely good." Gregory's face was ashen. Bianca looked like she was about to be sick. "Some people might look at a person's circumstances and call them a nobody." Liam continued, his voice hardening slightly as he quoted Gregory's own cruel words. "But they're wrong. The real nobodies are the ones who have everything and value nothing. The ones whose hearts are empty." He stepped off the stage and walked directly to Dina's table. The entire room held its breath. He stopped in front of her, his eyes shining with a love so profound it was palpable. Then, in front of the assembled titans of industry, the high society mavens, and the man who had tried to destroy her, Liam Davenport, got down on one knee. He took her hand. "Dina Faria, you are the most somebody I have ever known. You are my anchor, my inspiration, and the love of my life. Will you marry me?" He opened a small velvet box to reveal a ring with a single perfect sapphire, the exact color of her dress, her eyes. It was elegant, timeless, and infinitely more beautiful than Bianca's garish diamond. Tears streamed down Dina's face, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The world with all its noise and judgment faded away. There was only him. Yes, she breathed. Leo, yes! Liam slid the ring onto her finger as the ballroom erupted, not with polite applause but with a roar of genuine shock and excitement. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi who had snuck into the back went off like a strobe light, capturing the moment for eternity. The humiliated ex-wife, the proposing billionaire, and the utterly annihilated faces of Gregory and Bianca on their dais forgotten and upstaged at their own celebration. It was not just a proposal. It was a coronation. The chaos of the ballroom with its roar of shock and flurry of camera flashes dissolved the moment they slipped through the heavy velvet curtains of a service exit. The sudden silence was a shock in itself, broken only by the distant wail of a city siren. A blast of cold November air hit Dina, feeling sharp and clean against her flushed cheeks. It was real. Everything that had just happened was real. Liam kept his arm securely around her, guiding her down a quiet side street away from the hotel's main entrance. He hailed a lone taxi, its yellow light a beacon in the darkness. Inside, as the cab pulled into the stream of traffic, Dina finally let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hand, now adorned with the stunning sapphire ring, trembled in her lap. "Are you okay?" Liam asked, his voice a low, concerned rumble that seemed to absorb the frantic energy still thrumming through her veins. She looked at him, his familiar, kind face illuminated by the passing streetlights. He wasn't looking at her with triumph, but with a gentle, searching expression. I think so," she stammered, a hysterical little laugh bubbling up. "That was a lot." "I know. And I'm sorry if the setting was overwhelming," he said, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and steady. "But I need you to know, Dina, that wasn't for them. It wasn't about putting on a show or getting revenge on Shaw. I meant every word. I saw my moment with the woman I love and I took it. Their presence was just background noise." His sincerity washed over her, calming the last of her fears. He saw her. He had seen her in the coffee shop, he had seen her in the museum, and he saw her now. The public nature of the proposal was a consequence of their complicated lives, not a weapon. "I know Leo," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder as the city blurred past the window. "Thank you." Instead of going home, they had the driver drop them at the entrance to Central Park. The park was vast and quiet at this hour, a sleeping giant in the heart of the city. They walked for what felt like hours, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. Under the stark skeletal branches of the winter trees, they planned a future not with the grand performative gestures of her past life, but with the quiet, earnest promises of a shared life. They talked about where they would live, about her gallery, about his dream of building a school for underprivileged kids. They were two souls stripped of their public personas, simply building a world together. The next morning, the background noise Liam had spoken of became a deafening roar. Dina awoke in her own sun-drenched apartment to the incessant buzzing of her phone on the nightstand. She had dozens of missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize and a flood of texts from acquaintances old and new. Cautiously, she opened a news app. Her own face stared back at her. It was a candid shot captured in the split second after she'd said yes. Her face was luminous, streaked with tears of joy, while Liam's expression was one of pure adoration. Behind them, out of focus but unmistakable, were the horrified faces of Gregory and Bianca. The headlines were a surreal collection of modern fairy tale tropes, from nobody to I do, billionaire's shock proposal, upend society. The ultimate checkmate, how a scorned ex-wife won it all. Love not revenge, Davenport proposes to Shaw's ex at engagement party. The narrative was intoxicating, and the world had devoured it overnight. Dina felt a strange mix of terror and vindication. She had never sought the spotlight, but seeing Gregory's cruelty framed for what it was, petty and pathetic, felt like a long overdue validation. Liam, ever perceptive, seemed to know she would be overwhelmed. A delivery arrived mid-morning, not flowers but 2 large bags of groceries and a single perfect croissant from her favorite bakery. The note attached simply said, "Stay in. Ignore the noise. I'll be there tonight. We'll order pizza. Leo." The simple domestic gesture was more reassuring than any grand declaration. It was a promise of normalcy in the midst of madness. For Gregory and Bianca, there was no escaping the noise. The story painted him as a villain and her as a fool. Their carefully constructed image of a power couple had been shattered. Friends who were really just allies of convenience described Gregory to reporters as arrogant and having a blind spot. Bianca's circle whispered that she was utterly humiliated, more concerned with being upstaged than with her broken engagement. The union, built on the shallow ground of status and image, couldn't survive the public ridicule. Within a week, a terse statement from the Vanderbilt family confirmed the engagement was off. The professional fallout for Gregory was a slower, more insidious poison. The story of his public cruelty became a cautionary tale in boardrooms. It revealed a profound lack of emotional intelligence and foresight. How could a man who so badly misjudged the character of 2 women be trusted to navigate a complex, multi-billion-dollar merger, a major European conglomerate citing a crisis of confidence in senior leadership, pulled out of a landmark deal with his firm? His partners grew distant. His power, which he had wielded like a weapon, was evaporating. He was being undone not by a corporate raider, but by the echoes of his own words. 6 months passed. The media storm subsided into a low hum, and Dina used the time to build. With Liam's mentorship and the business plan she poured her soul into, she secured a loan and found the perfect space. Opening night at the Faria Gallery was the polar opposite of the Plaza Hotel Gala. The air wasn't thick with judgment and Chanel No. 5, but with the scent of fresh paint, the excited chatter of artists, and a current of genuine passion. The space was intimate and welcoming, with clean white walls that made the vibrant, challenging art she'd chosen seem to leap out at the viewer. Dressed in a simple, chic linen dress, Dina was the calm, confident center of it all. She moved through the room with a grace that was entirely her own, discussing the impasto technique of a young painter with a critic from the New York Times, then sharing a laugh with one of the artists she was featuring. An older woman, a distant but kind acquaintance from her country club days, approached her. "Dina, dear," she said, her eyes warm. "I never said it before, but I was so sorry for how Gregory treated you. I am just so thrilled to see you like this. You're glowing." The simple, honest words meant more to Dina than 1,000 fawning headlines. Liam stood near the back, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching her. He had insisted the night be entirely hers. When a journalist had tried to ask him a question, he had simply smiled and said, "Tonight is not about me. It's about the brilliant work Dina is championing." He saw the fire and passion in her as she commanded the room, not with arrogance, but with the quiet authority of someone who had found her true calling. This was the woman he had seen sketching on a napkin the soul he had connected with. Her success was the inevitable blossoming of a seed that had been there all along. Later, when the last of the guests had drifted out into the warm spring night, he came and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. She leaned back against his chest with a contented sigh, the day's adrenaline giving way to a deep, satisfying peace. Together they looked around the beautiful space she had created. "Happy," he whispered into her ear. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, turning in his arms to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "Thank you, Leo, for everything." "Don't thank me," he said, his expression serious as he tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You did this. You walked through the fire and came out stronger. You built this place with your own vision, your own hard work. I just had the ridiculously good sense to fall in love with you along the way." She smiled, her heart full. "Our wedding," she said softly. "I want it to be like this, not like that." He knew exactly what she meant. "No ballrooms," he agreed. "No press. Just us, a few trees, and the people we love." Their life together, like her gallery, would be a curated space filled only with things that were authentic, meaningful, and real. Dina looked from his loving face to the canvases on the wall. She thought of the stormy seascape she had painted on her darkest night. The storm had been real, the waves violent and terrifying. But storms pass. She was no longer battling the waves. She was the architect of the lighthouse, a steady guiding light built on a foundation of her own making. Gregory had called her a nobody, believing her worth was a reflection of his own. He never understood that a person's true value isn't something that can be given or taken away. It is forged in fire, and it belongs only to you. Dina's story isn't just about finding love. It's a powerful reminder that your value is never determined by someone else's opinion. It's about the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild your life from scratch. She was labeled a nobody by a man who could only see worth in terms of status and wealth, but she refused to let that label define her. Her journey shows us that the most powerful transformations often begin in our lowest moments, and that true love doesn't rescue you. It sees you, empowers you, and stands by your side as you rescue yourself. If you were moved by Dina's incredible journey from heartbreak to triumph, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder of their own worth. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of love, resilience, and the sweet taste of poetic justice. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening. Some divorces end with tears and a cardboard box of memories. Eleanor Bailey's divorce ended with public humiliation and the cold, hard gavel of a judge declaring her life as she knew it officially over. Her husband, the charismatic titan of finance, Richard Sterling, took the Greenwich mansion, the friends, the status, everything. He left her with a pittance and a condescending smile, a forgotten woman pushed to the edge of society. But what no one knew, what Richard in his arrogance could never have imagined, was the secret she held. It wasn't in a bank account. It was in a dusty box of her father's old notebooks. This isn't a story about luck. It's the story of how a woman with nothing became a ghost from her ex-husband's past, returning to shock the world with a $50 million fortune. The air in the Connecticut Superior Court was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet, predatory judgment. Eleanor Bailey sat perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. Across from her, Richard Sterling, her husband of 22 years, looked magnificent. His suit was a custom-tailored masterpiece of charcoal gray silk. His silver hair was coiffed perfectly, and he occasionally leaned over to whisper something to his lawyer, the formidable Arthur Croft, that would elicit a confident smirk. They were a portrait of power. Eleanor was a portrait of obsolescence. The last year had been a masterclass in slow, deliberate demolition. Richard hadn't just decided he wanted a divorce, he had decided to erase her. It started with the subtle slights at cocktail parties, the "Eleanor doesn't quite grasp the market dynamics" comments, the gentle pat on her hand as he took over a conversation she was having. Then came the younger, sleeker woman, a gallery owner named Isabella Rossi, who suddenly appeared at every charity gala, her laughter echoing a little too loudly near Richard's ear. The friends who she had once believed were their friends had vanished like mist. Dinners she had hosted for 2 decades were now events she learned about on Instagram. Luncheon invitations from women like Margot Hadley, whose children she had practically raised alongside her own, simply stopped coming. She had become a social liability, the aging, soon-to-be discarded model. The courtroom was the final brutal stage of this erasure. Arthur Croft was painting a picture of Eleanor as a woman who had contributed nothing. Mrs. Sterling enjoyed a lifestyle of immense privilege, he boomed, his voice filling the cavernous room. Funded entirely by Mr. Sterling's tireless work, his genius in navigating the volatile world of high finance. She pursued hobbies, gardening, charity committees, book clubs. He said the words as if they were contaminants. Eleanor's lawyer, a kind but overwhelmed public aid lawyer named Sarah Jenkins, did her best. She spoke of Eleanor's emotional labor of raising their 2 children, Michael and Chloe, who were now adults, and conspicuously absent, having been poisoned by their father's narrative and his checkbook. She spoke of the home Eleanor had made, the support system she had provided that allowed Richard to become the titan he was. But in a world that measured value in dollars and cents, Sarah's arguments were whispers against Croft's hurricane of financial statements and asset portfolios. Richard had been meticulous. For years he had been moving assets into trusts and corporate structures so complex they made Eleanor's head spin. The prenuptial agreement she had signed in a haze of love and naivety 2 decades ago was, as Croft put it, a fortress of fiscal prudence. The judge, a stern-faced man named Judge Alistair Hayes, seemed to be looking at her with a mixture of pity and impatience. Finally, the verdict came down. It was a massacre. Richard would retain the Greenwich estate, the Aspen Ski Lodge, the art collection, the investment portfolios, and the entirety of his controlling stake in Sterling Capital. Eleanor was awarded a one-time alimony payment of $150,000. To assist in her transition, the judge said without a trace of irony, she was also allowed to keep her personal belongings and one other item stipulated as a non-marital asset from her own family, a few boxes of her late father's personal effects, which had been stored in the attic. Richard had laughed when her lawyer mentioned them. "Let her have the junk," he'd said magnanimously. The gavel fell. The sound cracked through the room, a definitive final punctuation mark on her life as Eleanor Sterling. She was now just Eleanor Bailey. The name felt foreign, a garment she hadn't worn in decades. As she walked out of the courtroom, a ghost in her own life, a reporter from a local gossip column shoved a microphone in her face. "Mrs. Sterling, I mean Ms. Bailey, any comment on the settlement? Do you feel it was fair?" Before she could even form a thought, Richard swept by his arm possessively around Isabella, who was dressed in a razor-sharp white suit. He paused, gave the reporter a charming smile, and said, "Eleanor and I had a wonderful life together. I wish her all the best in finding her own way." The condescension was a physical blow. He didn't see a person. He saw a problem that had been neatly and inexpensively solved. As his town car pulled away from the curb, splashing muddy water onto the hem of her simple dress, Eleanor stood alone on the courthouse steps. The $150,000 felt less like a lifeline and more like severance pay for a job she'd been fired from. It was enough to find a small apartment and exist for a year or two, but it was nothing. It was an insult. She was 48 years old with no career, no husband, a fractured relationship with her children, and a future that looked like a vast gray empty plain. The world that had once been her stage was now a locked theater, and she didn't even have a ticket. All she had was the name Bailey, a check for chump change, and a few dusty boxes of her father's junk. The first 6 months of Eleanor's new life were a study in gray. She found a small one-bedroom apartment in a slightly worn-down building in Stamford, a world away from the manicured lawns of Greenwich. The silence was the first thing that struck her. In the mansion there had always been a hum, the distant chatter of the cleaning staff, the gentle whir of the pool filter, the chime of the grandfather clock. Here the silence was an active, oppressive force broken only by the sound of traffic from the street below, or the muffled arguments of her neighbors through the thin walls. She spent the first few weeks in a fog of disbelief. She'd wake up and for a fleeting second expect to feel the high thread count Egyptian cotton sheets of her old bed. Instead, she felt the cheap polyester of a mattress she'd bought on sale. She'd reach for her phone to call Margot for their morning chat, only to remember that Margot's number would likely now be blocked. The $150,000 after legal fees and securing the apartment had dwindled to a terrifyingly small number. The reality of a budget was a foreign and brutal concept. She who had once debated the merits of a $10,000 handbag now stood in the grocery aisle calculating the price per ounce of different brands of coffee. It was a humiliation that was deeply intimately her own. To make ends meet and, more importantly, to escape the suffocating silence of the apartment, she took a job at the local public library. The pay was minimal, but the work was a strange comfort. Shelving books was a meditative act. She found a quiet solace in the scent of old paper and binding glue, a stark contrast to the metallic, sterile scent of Richard's world. Her colleagues were kind in a distant way, but she was an enigma to them, a woman with the quiet posture of old money who was now scanning barcodes for minimum wage. Loneliness was a constant companion. Her children, Michael and Chloe, were distant. Michael, a junior partner at a law firm that did business with his father, was polite but cool during their brief scheduled phone calls. Chloe, who was studying art history in London, was more sympathetic but had been thoroughly convinced by Richard that the divorce was a mutual, amicable decision and that Eleanor was being dramatic. "Dad's just trying to be happy, Mom," she'd said in one painful conversation. "He set you up comfortably. Why can't you just move on?" Eleanor didn't have the energy to explain that comfortably was a cruel joke, or that moving on felt like trying to run a marathon with 2 broken legs. One rainy Saturday, trapped in her apartment and feeling the walls close in, she decided to finally tackle the last vestiges of her old life, the 3 large dusty cardboard boxes from her father's collection that had been moved from the Greenwich attic to her tiny storage locker. Her father, Dr. Alistair Bailey, had been a quiet, unassuming man. He was a physics professor at a small, unremarkable state university. He passed away 10 years ago from a sudden heart attack, and her mother followed 2 years later, seemingly from a broken heart. To Richard, Alistair had been a source of mild embarrassment, a brilliant but unambitious man who was content with theory and academia instead of monetizing his intellect. "Your father could have been a contender," Richard used to say, but he was happy tinkering in his garage. Eleanor dragged the boxes into her small living room. The first 2 were filled with what she expected: old books on quantum mechanics, dusty photo albums, and neatly labeled rock collections. It was the 3rd box that was different. It was heavier, and when she opened it, she found it packed not with books, but with dozens of thick leather-bound notebooks. And nestled in the middle, wrapped in yellowing cheesecloth, was a strange metal object. It was a small, dull gray disc about the size of a coaster, etched with a complex, almost fractal-like pattern. A few thin wires protruded from its side, connected to nothing. It looked like a piece of junk, a failed experiment. She remembered her father spending countless hours in his workshop, and she vaguely recalled seeing this object on his workbench once. She'd asked what it was. He'd just smiled and said, "It's a little puzzle, Ellie, a way to talk to the sun." She set the useless-looking disc aside and picked up one of the notebooks. The first page was dated 30 years prior. The handwriting was her father's, a dense, spidery script, almost a code. But it wasn't just words. The pages were a labyrinth of mathematical equations, chemical formulas, and complex diagrams that made no sense to her. She flipped through notebook after notebook. They were filled with the same cryptic language. It was the secret diary of a mind she realized she had never truly known. Most people would have seen a box of academic nonsense. But for Eleanor, sitting on the floor of her lonely apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the void of her future, it felt like something else. It was a puzzle, a distraction. It was the last piece of her father she had left. With nothing else to anchor her, she decided for the first time in months to do something more than just survive. She decided to understand. The notebooks became Eleanor's obsession. They were her companions during the lonely evenings and her focus on the quiet weekends. She spent hours at the library, not just shelving books, but using her staff access to delve into the subjects her father had dedicated his life to: material science, quantum physics, and photocatalysis. The learning curve was brutally steep. She had been an English literature major, a woman who had spent her adult life discussing Proust, not protons. Initially, the equations were an impenetrable wall. But slowly, painstakingly, patterns began to emerge. Her father had a system. He used specific symbols for certain concepts, color-coded his annotations, and often in the margins he would write little philosophical asides in plain English. "Nature doesn't waste a single photon," one note read. "Why should we?" another asked. She started cross-referencing the notebooks with textbooks. She bought a whiteboard and filled her tiny living room wall with diagrams trying to replicate her father's thought process. Her apartment, once a symbol of her desolate loneliness, transformed into a chaotic sanctuary of intellectual pursuit. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the hum of a mind at work. After 3 months of relentless study, she had a breakthrough. Her father hadn't been tinkering randomly. He had been working on a single monumental problem, creating a hyper-efficient catalyst for photocatalytic water splitting. In layman's terms, he was trying to create a material that could use sunlight to split water H2O into hydrogen and oxygen with almost zero energy loss. The hydrogen could then be used as a perfectly clean, endlessly renewable fuel source. It was the holy grail of green energy, a problem that multi-billion-dollar corporations had thrown armies of scientists at for decades with only incremental success. The key, she discovered, was the strange fractal-like pattern etched onto the gray disk. It wasn't decorative. According to her father's notes, it was a quantum resonance matrix. The specific geometry of the etching was designed to capture a much wider spectrum of light than standard solar panels and funnel that energy with unprecedented efficiency to the catalyst material itself. The catalyst was the other half of the puzzle. The notes described a unique alloy, a composite of graphene tungsten disulfide, and a trace amount of a non-precious metal cobalt, all bonded at a molecular level in a way that conventional science deemed impossible. He had theorized a method of acoustic forging, using specific sound frequencies to align the molecules. It all sounded like science fiction. But the notebooks were filled with decades of failed experiments, meticulous adjustments, and finally a single page in the very last notebook. On it was a simple diagram of the disk, a final chemical formula, and 3 triumphant words underlined twice. Eureka! It works. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing. If her father was right, if that dull gray disk in her possession was what he claimed it wasn't junk. It was arguably one of the most important inventions of the century. A bitter irony washed over her. Richard, with all his financial acumen, had built an empire on trading on moving money around, on profiting from the work of others. Her quiet academic father, whom Richard had dismissed as a failure, may have actually created something of true world-changing value. But a theory in a notebook and a prototype in a box were worthless without proof. She needed to test it. She needed equipment she couldn't afford and expertise she didn't possess. The next phase of her journey would require more than just intellect. It would require her to step out of the shadows and back into a world that had already written her off. She found an old contact from her charity days, a retired engineering professor named Dr. Miles Corbin. She met him for coffee, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She laid out her father's notebooks, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to explain the complex science. Professor Corbin listened patiently, a skeptical but kind look on his face. He examined the diagrams, his brow furrowed in concentration. He picked up the disk, holding it to the light. "Alistair Bailey," he murmured, his eyes distant. "I remember him from a conference years ago. A brilliant man, always asking the questions no one else dared to. Everyone thought he was a bit of a dreamer." He spent an hour looking through her research. Finally, he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor, what your father has described here, it's revolutionary. It's also, by all current understanding, impossible. The energy efficiencies he's claiming are staggering. But can it be tested?" She pressed, her voice barely a whisper. He sighed. "To replicate this would require a material science lab with very specific, very expensive equipment. We're talking clean rooms, molecular beam epitaxy systems, spectrographs. A university might have it, but they won't just let a civilian walk in and use it. And a private lab would charge a fortune." He paused, looking at her with genuine sympathy. "Frankly, without significant backing, this is just a fascinating theory." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Significant backing. Fortune. These were words from her old life, a language she no longer spoke. For a moment the crushing weight of her reality returned. She was a librarian, a divorcee in a cheap apartment. She had a world-changing idea that might as well be written in invisible ink for all the good it would do her. But as she looked down at her father's confident, determined script, a new feeling began to smolder within her defiance. The world had told her she was nothing. Her father's legacy was telling her she could be everything. Armed with Professor Corbin's validation, Eleanor knew she couldn't give up. The theory was sound. She just needed the capital to prove it. The world she needed to enter was one she knew only through Richard, the cutthroat arena of venture capital. She spent a month turning her father's dense academic work into a polished professional business proposal. She named the nascent company Helios Legacy, a tribute to her father and the son he had sought to harness. She created charts, projected energy outputs, and outlined a plan for developing a commercial-grade prototype. Her first meeting was with a mid-tier VC firm in New York, secured through a tenuous link from one of her old, now-defunct charity contacts. She walked into a boardroom of glass and chrome, her simple blazer feeling like a cheap costume. 4 men in their early 30s, all with identical haircuts and expensive watches, listened to her presentation with expressions of profound boredom. "So let me get this straight," one of them, a man named Kyle, said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "You, with a background in English literature, have discovered the solution to the global energy crisis in your dead father's old notebooks." The condescension was a familiar poison. "My father was a dedicated physicist," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The science is complex, but it is all there. I just need the seed funding to build a working model and validate his findings." Another partner, Jason, scoffed. "And you have no patents, no existing proof of concept outside of this thing." He gestured dismissively at the gray disk she had placed on the polished table. "Look, Ms. Bailey, we see 100 revolutionary ideas a week. They come from PhDs out of MIT, from teams with proven track records. You are, with all due respect, a housewife." The word housewife hung in the air, an epitaph for her credibility. The meeting was over before it began. It was the first of many such humiliations. She traveled to Boston and then, using a large chunk of her remaining funds, to Silicon Valley. The story was always the same. They saw her age, her gender, her lack of a tech background, and they showed her the door. The most brutal rejection came from a top-tier firm, Pinnacle Ventures, run by a notoriously sharp-tongued investor named Marcus Thorne. Thorne didn't even let her finish her second slide. "Stop," he said, holding up a hand. "I know your ex-husband, Richard Sterling. Brilliant man, tough negotiator. Did a deal with him back in '08. He must have left you with a nice little nest egg. Is this a vanity project, a hobby to keep you busy?" Eleanor was stunned into silence. The mention of Richard, the insinuation that this was some bored whim, was a deep personal cut. "I am here on the merits of the science," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Thorne chuckled. "The merits of the science are irrelevant if the presenter has zero credibility. You're unbackable. You're a risk no one in this valley would ever take. My advice: go back to Connecticut. Enjoy your alimony. This is not your world." She walked out of that Palo Alto office into the blinding California sun, feeling utterly defeated. Marcus Thorne's words echoed in her head. This is not your world. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was a fool chasing a ghost in a dead man's notebook. That night, in a cheap motel room that smelled of disinfectant, she called her old friend Clara Jenkins. Not the lawyer, but a sharp-witted art curator she'd known in college, one of the few people who hadn't abandoned her after the divorce. "They're all the same, Clara." Eleanor wept into the phone, the frustration and humiliation of weeks pouring out of her. "They don't see the science. They just see a middle-aged divorced woman. They see Richard's ex-wife." Clara listened patiently before responding, her voice firm. "Of course that's what they see, Elle. That's their business pattern recognition. They look for the young guy in the hoodie who dropped out of Stanford. You don't fit the pattern, So you have to break the pattern. You can't ask them for money to prove it. You have to prove it first, and then make them beg to give you money." "And how am I supposed to do that?" Eleanor asked, her voice thick with despair. "I need a lab. I need engineers." "Then you build one," Clara said simply. "You've got that settlement money left right in your mother's jewelry. The pearls, the diamond earrings. You never wear them. They're just memories of a life that's gone. Sell it all. Go all in. Bet on yourself, Eleanor. Bet on your dad." The idea was terrifying. It was her last safety net. Selling those things meant there was truly no going back. It was the final act of severing her past. But Clara's words sparked something in her. Defiance. The next day, Eleanor flew back to the East Coast. She didn't go to Stanford. She went to a reputable jeweler in Manhattan and sold every last piece of jewelry from her former life. She liquidated the remainder of her small investment account. She gathered every penny she had in the world. It came to just over $95,000. It wasn't venture capital money, but it was a start. She rented a small, grimy garage space in an industrial park in New Jersey. It was cold and smelled of oil, but it was hers. Then she started looking for an engineer. Not a seasoned professional who would demand a six-figure salary, but someone young, brilliant, and overlooked. Someone like her. She found him through a university job board, Ben Carter. He was 24, a recent master's graduate in material science from Rutgers, and he was drowning in student debt. He was working a dead-end job calibrating equipment for a plastics company. When Eleanor showed him her father's notebooks, his eyes, which had been dull with boredom during their initial introduction, lit up with a feverish intensity. This is insane," he whispered, tracing the equations with his finger. "This acoustic forging. It's theoretically possible, but the energy requirements, the frequency modulation, no one's ever been able to control it." "My father believed he did," Eleanor said. Ben looked up from the notebooks, then around the shabby garage, and then at Eleanor. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same passion for a scientific puzzle that he felt in his own gut. He didn't see a housewife. He saw a visionary. "I'll need to build a custom resonance chamber," he said, his mind already racing. "We'll need an oscillant matrix, a power inverter. We can source most of the parts used, but the cobalt composite will have to be custom-sintered." "Can you do it?" Eleanor asked, holding her breath. Ben broke into a wide, infectious grin. "Ms. Bailey," he said, "for a chance to work on this, I'd do it for free. Let's build it." For the next 4 months, the garage in New Jersey became their entire world. They worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and pizza. Eleanor handled the research and translated her father's complex theories, while Ben, a prodigy with electronics and machinery, MacGyvered together a laboratory from second-hand parts and custom-built rigs. They blew fuses, burned out capacitors, and came close to giving up a dozen times. The $95,000 vanished with terrifying speed. But finally, one cold November night, it was ready. A small lead-lined chamber, a series of powerful amplifiers, and at its center a microscopic plate of their carefully prepared alloy. Ben took a deep breath. "Okay. Powering up the acoustic forge. If the calculations are right, the frequency should align the cobalt molecules into a stable lattice. If they're wrong, well, it'll probably just melt." Eleanor watched, her heart in her throat, as Ben initiated the sequence. A low hum filled the garage, rising in pitch until it was almost unbearable. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then on the monitor displaying the atomic force microscope's readings, a new pattern began to form. A perfect repeating hexagonal lattice. The impossible structure from her father's notebook was materializing before her very eyes. It had worked. They had done it. Creating the catalyst was only the first step. The real test was whether it could perform as Alistair Bailey had predicted. Ben meticulously etched the newly forged catalyst material onto a disc identical to the prototype Eleanor's father had left her. They then constructed a simple but effective testing apparatus, a sealed container of purified water, the disk at the bottom, and a high-intensity solar spectrum lamp positioned above it. A gas collection system would measure the output of hydrogen and oxygen. According to your father's projections, Ben said, his voice tense with anticipation. At this light intensity, we should see a quantum efficiency of around 98%. The best lab results in the world right now are hovering around 18%, and that's with platinum-based catalysts that cost a fortune. 98% efficiency sounds impossible, Eleanor said, voicing the doubt that had been her constant companion. I know, Ben replied, a nervous energy buzzing around him. That's what makes it so exciting. He flipped the switch on the lamp. A brilliant sun-like light flooded the container. For a moment, nothing happened. Eleanor felt her stomach sink. All that work, all that money, her last hope. Was it all for nothing? Then she saw it. A tiny bubble rising from the surface of the disk, and then another, and another. Within seconds, a furious champagne-like fizz of bubbles was streaming from the disk, a torrent of pure hydrogen and oxygen. The digital gauges on the gas chromatograph flickered to life, the numbers climbing at a dizzying rate. Ben stared at the screen, his mouth agape. Ellie, look at this. Eleanor leaned in. The readout was stable, the numbers unbelievable. Quantum efficiency 98.7%. They had not only replicated her father's work, they had proven it. The energy loss was practically zero. This little gray disk could produce clean fuel from water and light more efficiently than a plant performs photosynthesis. It wasn't just an improvement on existing technology. It was a quantum leap, a fundamental paradigm shift. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. Tears of joy, of relief, of profound bone-deep vindication. She thought of her quiet, brilliant father toiling away in his workshop, dismissed by the world. "He did it," she whispered. "He really did it." Ben let out a whoop of pure joy, grabbing Eleanor in a spontaneous, awkward hug. "We did it. This changes everything." Once the euphoria subsided, a cold, strategic reality set in. They had a working prototype, but they were vulnerable. An idea this big could be stolen in a heartbeat. Before they showed this to anyone, they needed protection. Eleanor used the last fumes of her savings to hire a top-tier patent lawyer, a woman named Fiona Shaw, who specialized in disruptive technologies. Fiona, a sharp and perceptive woman, immediately grasped the magnitude of their discovery. "This is dynamite," Fiona said after reviewing their data. "We need to file a comprehensive utility patent immediately covering the catalyst composition, the acoustic forging method, and the geometric design of the resonance matrix. We file in the US, Europe, and Asia simultaneously. It will be expensive, but it's non-negotiable." The patent process was a frantic 2-month-long race against time, draining the last of their resources. Ben and Eleanor lived on credit cards and instant noodles, their entire existence focused on documenting every detail of their work. With the patents filed and pending, it was time to emerge from the garage. They needed to make a splash, but on their own terms. Rather than going back to the VCs who had scorned her, Eleanor and Fiona devised a different strategy. They would bypass the gatekeepers and go straight to the scientific community. They booked a small booth at the Future Energy Summit in San Francisco, a major industry conference attended by leading scientists, engineers, corporate scouts, and of course venture capitalists. It was an enormous gamble. Their booth was tiny, tucked away in a corner, far from the massive flashy displays of corporate giants like Siemens and General Electric. Their display consisted of a small table, a poster board with their data, and their humble testing apparatus running live for all to see. For the first day, they were mostly ignored. People walked by, glancing at the unknown Helios Legacy logo and moving on to bigger names. But a few graduate students and postdocs, intrigued by the impossible efficiency numbers on their poster, stopped to watch the live demonstration. They asked skeptical questions, which Ben answered with a quiet, unshakable confidence, pointing to the real-time data streaming from the gas chromatograph. A whisper started. By the afternoon of the second day, the whisper had become a buzz. a renowned professor from Caltech, Dr. Eris Thorne. No relation to Marcus, thankfully spent an hour at their booth running his own calculations on a notepad and staring at the furious bubbling in their test chamber. At the end, he shook his head in disbelief, looked at Eleanor and said loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, "My God, you've actually solved the hydrogen problem." That was the spark that lit the fire. Suddenly their small booth was the epicenter of the entire conference. People were packed 10 deep, craning their necks to see the little gray disk that was quietly rewriting the laws of energy production. Corporate scouts from Shell, Tesla, and Aura Innovations were shouldering their way to the front, their faces a mixture of shock and avarice. And then Eleanor saw him. Making his way through the crowd, his face pale with disbelief, was Marcus Thorne, the VC, who had told her to go back to Connecticut. He stood at the edge of the crowd, staring at her at the device at the throng of influential people surrounding them. His expression was no longer one of smug superiority. It was the look of a man who had just witnessed a ghost win the lottery. Eleanor met his gaze for a brief second, held it, and then gave him a small, polite, and utterly devastating smile before turning away to speak with a senior executive from the Department of Energy. She didn't need to say a word. The roar of the crowd said it all. This was her world now. The aftermath of the conference was a whirlwind. Eleanor's phone, which had been silent for so long, now rang incessantly. Her inbox, once filled with spam and bills, was overflowing with emails from addresses ending in @goldmansachs.com, @google.com, search Google.com, and every major venture capital firm on Sand Hill Road. The men who had laughed her out of their boardrooms were now sending groveling messages requesting just 5 minutes of her time. Marcus Thorne tried to call 3 times. Eleanor let it go to voicemail. She, Ben, and Fiona set up a temporary headquarters in a modest hotel suite in San Francisco. It was their war room. Offers began pouring in. The initial proposals were for seed funding, a few $1 million for a 40% stake in Helios Legacy. "Absolutely not," Fiona stated, circling the numbers on a whiteboard with a red marker. "They're trying to buy a diamond for the price of glass. We are not selling equity. We are fielding offers for licensing or a full acquisition. We hold all the cards." Eleanor, to her own surprise, felt a calm resolve settle over her. The desperate, timid woman who had trembled before investors was gone. In her place was a CEO. She had fought her way out of the darkness, and she was not about to sell her father's legacy and her own hard-won victory for pennies on the dollar. "Fiona's right," Eleanor said, her voice clear and firm. "We control the timeline. We will listen to offers from major technology and energy corporations only. No VCs." The decision sent a shockwave through the investment community. It was an audacious move for a company that a week ago didn't even exist. But it worked. The seriousness of their position attracted the apex predators of the corporate world. The first major player to the table was Julian Croft, the legendary and somewhat reclusive CEO of Aura Innovations, a tech giant famous for its revolutionary battery technology and electric vehicles. Unlike the others, Croft didn't send a team of subordinates. He requested to meet with Eleanor personally. They met in a private dining room overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Julian Croft was in his late 50s, with an intense gaze and a reputation for being able to see 10 years into the future. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've read your father's abstracts, Ms. Bailey." He began, his voice a low baritone. "The ones he published in obscure journals 20 years ago. No one paid attention. I should have. What you've accomplished is not just an invention. It's an extinction-level event for the fossil fuel industry." He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes appraising her not as a woman or a divorcee, but as a peer. "I'm not here to lowball you or steal your company. I'm here to give your father's legacy the global platform it deserves. Aura has the manufacturing infrastructure, the supply chains, and the political capital to make this technology the new global standard within 5 years. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a complex term sheet, just a number. An offer to acquire Helios Legacy, the patents, the prototype, and the proprietary forging process. Eleanor looked at the number. Her breath caught in her throat. $50, $1,000, $1,000. $50 million. The number was so vast, so astronomical that it seemed unreal. It was a number that meant freedom. It meant security. It meant her father's name in history books. "This is a very generous offer, Mr. Croft," she managed to say. "It is a fair offer," he corrected her. "And it's just my opening bid. I know for a fact that both Siemens and Hyundai are preparing their own offers. A bidding war is about to begin, Ms. Bailey. But I want you to know that our offer includes something theirs won't, a permanent endowed chair in physics in your father's name at Stanford University, and a leadership role for you to oversee the integration of Helios technology into Aura's energy division. I don't just want your patent. I want the mind that was smart enough to see its value when no one else did." Eleanor felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her. He wasn't just offering her money. He was offering her respect. He was offering her a seat at the table she had been told she could never even approach. The next week was a blur of frantic negotiations. As Croft predicted, other offers came in, driving the price higher. A German conglomerate offered $65 million. A Korean tech giant went to $80 million. Fiona was in her element, skillfully playing the bidders against each other. But Eleanor's mind kept returning to Julian Croft's offer. The money was life-changing no matter what, but the legacy component, the professorship in her father's name, the chance to shepherd his vision into the world that was priceless. In the end, they went back to Aura. Fiona secured a final acquisition price of $92 million, with an additional performance-based stock package for Eleanor and a significant bonus and research position for Ben Carter. Part of the deal insisted upon by Eleanor was the immediate funding and establishment of the Dr. Alistair Bailey Center for Sustainable Energy at Stanford. The day the deal was finalized, the news broke across every major financial news network. Aura Innovations acquires mystery startup Helios Legacy for nearly $100. The unknown woman who just revolutionized clean energy. The articles featured a picture of her from the conference, poised, confident, and surrounded by admirers. Her name was everywhere: Eleanor Bailey. Not Sterling. Bailey. Sitting in her hotel room watching the news ticker on TV flash her name, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. The money was staggering, but the true wealth was in the journey. She had walked through the fire of humiliation and emerged not just intact, but forged into someone stronger than she had ever imagined. She had honored her father, built a company, and reclaimed her own identity. The world had finally learned her name, and she knew with chilling certainty that in a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, a man named Richard Sterling was learning it too. The news of Eleanor's 9-figure windfall hit the insulated community of Greenwich like a sonic boom. It was simply incomprehensible. The story spread through the country club, over hushed lunches at exclusive restaurants, and in gossipy text chains between the very women who had ostracized her. Eleanor Bailey. The quiet, mousy woman Richard had so efficiently discarded, a tech mogul. It didn't compute. It was as if their former gardener had just been elected president. For Richard Sterling, the news was a personal and professional cataclysm. He was at his desk reviewing quarterly reports when his partner, a man named George, burst into his office, his face ashen. "Rick, have you seen this? You need to see this," George said, throwing a copy of the Wall Street Journal onto his desk. The headline was stark: "The Housewife and the Holy Grail. How Eleanor Bailey Turned Her Father's Junk into a $92 million fortune." Richard read the article, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the paper. The story laid it all out: the obscure physicist father, the ignored notebooks, the brutal divorce settlement, the rejections from VCs, including a particularly embarrassing quote from a furious Marcus Thorne about his biggest miss ever, and the final triumphant acquisition by Aura Innovations. Every word was a nail in the coffin of his pride. She had done it without him. She had used the junk from the attic that he had laughed at. She had built an empire from the ashes of the life he had burned down. But the most galling part was that he, a man who prided himself on seeing value where others didn't, had been sitting on top of a gold mine for years and had been too arrogant and dismissive to ever look down. His phone began to ring. It was a business associate. "Richard, my God, is this true? You're Eleanor, I can't believe it." The tone wasn't congratulatory. It was tinged with a morbid, gleeful curiosity. He was no longer the powerful Richard Sterling. He was the idiot who let $100 million fortune walk out the door. His carefully constructed world began to fray. His new wife Isabella saw the news, and her demeanor subtly shifted. The worshipful gaze she once gave him was now colored with a new calculating assessment. Had she hitched her wagon to the wrong Sterling a week later, Eleanor returned to Connecticut. Not to Stamford, but to Greenwich. She had come to finalize the sale of a small property her mother had left her, a matter her old lawyer couldn't handle. She was checking out of the Delamar Hotel when she saw him. Richard was waiting for her in the lobby. He looked older, smaller than she remembered. He was trying for his old easy charm, but there was a desperate edge to his smile. "Ellie," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "I saw the news. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. I always knew you had it in you. That sharp mind of yours." Eleanor looked at him, feeling nothing. No anger, no pain. Just a vast, calm distance. "Hello, Richard," she said, her tone polite but detached. "I was a fool, Ellie. A blind, arrogant fool," he continued, stepping closer. "What I did to you, it was unforgivable. I was under so much pressure with the business and—" "Isabella." He said the name as if it were an excuse. "But seeing what you've accomplished, it's made me realize what I lost. You were always the brilliant one, my secret weapon." It was a masterful performance, the kind he had used to charm investors and rivals for decades. But it didn't work on her anymore. She had seen behind the curtain. "My father was the brilliant one," she corrected him quietly. "I was just the first person to listen. We could be a team again." He pressed, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying mix of regret and opportunism. "Think of it. Your vision, my business acumen. We could build an empire that would dwarf Sterling Capital. We could get it all back." Eleanor finally understood. He wasn't apologizing. He was pitching. She was no longer a discarded wife. She was a potential acquisition, a new asset to be folded into his portfolio. She gave a small, sad shake of her head. "You still don't get it, do you, Richard?" she said, her voice soft but clear as glass. "You think this was about money. You think my success is something you can now leverage. This was never about getting back at you. It was about getting back to me." She looked past him toward the waiting car outside. "My name is Eleanor Bailey. My work, my fortune, it's all under that name. The name Sterling is a part of my past. I have no interest in making it a part of my future. I wish you well." She walked past him without a second glance. He didn't try to stop her. He just stood there in the opulent lobby, a relic of a bygone era in her life, watching as she stepped into a sleek black Aura town car, the kind of car that used to pick him up and drove away. As the car pulled onto the highway, Eleanor looked out at the passing landscape. She wasn't just leaving Richard behind. She was leaving behind the ghost of the woman she used to be. She wasn't an ex-wife anymore. She wasn't divorced and alone. She was the founder of Helios Legacy, a leader at one of the most innovative companies in the world, and the proud daughter of Dr. Alistair Bailey. Her fortune wasn't the $92 million in the bank. It was the unshakable knowledge that she had built her new life piece by piece with her own two hands and her own brilliant mind. And that was a treasure no one could ever take from her. Eleanor Bailey's story isn't just about getting rich. It's about the incredible power of resilience and the hidden value we all possess. Her ex-husband and the entire world looked at her and saw nothing. But they were looking at the surface at the labels society had given her wife, mother, divorcee. They never thought to look deeper at the intellect, the grit, and the legacy she carried within her. Her story is a powerful reminder that our lowest moments can often be the foundation for our greatest triumphs. It proves that wealth isn't just about money, it's about reclaiming your own name, your own story, and your own power. So we want to ask you, what hidden legacy are you sitting on? What forgotten passion or overlooked skill do you have that the world has told you is just junk? Eleanor's story shows us that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in the attics of our own lives, just waiting to be rediscovered. If this story inspired you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of triumph against the odds. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.